So we're going to talk again, not a programming one, but yet another organizational or tasking or agile kind of, you run into this problem a lot when you're trying to size work and be predictable. And this is when the first one of something is way bigger than all the rest of them. And a lot of times it's because of the amount of bundling we do in the first one. So this talk is really about, how we can break down our work in a way and be disciplined about breaking down work so that we get better predictability. And the main thing is the first time we do something, if we have some scaffolding to build or some baseline work to do, a lot of times we'll bundle that in with the first of something. And then all the follow-ons are really small and we're like, oh, the first one takes 3 months and everyone after that's 3 days or something like that. So we're going to talk really and trying to figure out when the question is, how do we recognize when we're bundling, right? And what I'm going to say here in this case is we have 3 use cases and the use cases are about the same size. Let's say it's something like we're going to add security to something. We're going to implement help. We're going to roll out some new type of thing to a factory floor, right? And the first use case is like several times larger than the other 3, right? In this case, than the next 2. So that means we're probably bundling something, or we've bundled a bunch of unknowns into the first case, right? So the similar work items exist, and the first one is significantly larger, and it's because the first one has a bunch of decisions that don't exist in the rest. And I would actually argue that in this case, that means that we bundled things that don't belong. So I'm going to what are we talking about here? So, we're going to create some new implementation that is expected to be relied on across multiple components or services. We are going to create a new database access layer, and it is going to be used in these 3 services, right? And we're going to roll this, or we're going to roll this addition out across multiple services. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to say we have 3 different use cases. Each of those use cases has got its own tests. There's some base functionality that we're going to create, and that base functionality is going to have some NFRs, non-functional requirements that are baked into it. So it's not only a functional bit of base functionality, it's also the non-functional requirements. It's got to be reliable, it's got to be scalable, it's got to have metrics, all this kind of thing. We're going to build into some plumbing, and then that plumbing is going to be used in these use cases, right? And then we're going to build base tests around this. So if you look at this, we have 3 use cases with their tests, and then we've got some common capability that we're going to, I call it functionality here, but I should have called it common capabilities, and they're going to be tests for that, and there's going to be NFR support. And so there's like this stuff that doesn't necessarily apply to the individual use cases because they're going to be built on top of it, right? And really what we want to do is we want to do the breakdown in the user stories or in the features for this. We should break out the base functionality, the base test, the NFR support in one set of user stories or features, right? Maybe more than one. And then each one of the use cases with its tests should be isolated. And if you look at this, what does this mean? That means that use case 1, 2, and 3 here probably should be similarly sized, but we've got all this other work to do. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll actually bundle those together, right? So bundling seems easy, and it's because we're gonna be in there anyway. It's easier to write the tests if I don't have to write any tests for the base functionality, and I do them for the first use case, whatever, right? I'm already in there is the thing you already hear. And what this does is it creates this monster first use case, significantly larger than the rest of them. And it also bundles a bunch of unknowns into that. And now we get stuck on sizing, right? And what happens though is progress tracking can be hard too, right? Because use case 1 is also the base functionality. If you put it all together, you're like, man, I don't know where we are in this. Is it that I'm building the base functionality? Is that I'm working on the use case? It's hard to tell. Tracking becomes difficult. And what happens is we end up thinking that we can compact this. Oh, by putting these 2 things together, base functionality and use case 1 together, I actually am going to save time. I'm going to get time compression out of this because I didn't break these up. I didn't waterfall them. And what actually ends up happening is you end up blobbing all that crap together. And in this case here, I removed the use case. I removed the base functionality unit test. And so we think that saves us something. But if that was a third-party library off the internet, we wouldn't expect that. Why would we expect it in our own code? Really what it is a shortcut. We end up co-mingling the base functionality test with the use case test. This is bad. You shouldn't be doing this. We should make it look like the previous screen. And so this is how we end up with this monster first use case and a bunch of smaller ones. It's bad. You're going to want to do it. You're always going to do it. If it's only you on a project, you think it's going to be great. And the reality is it creates an opaque prediction, opaque velocity, and also it means that we can't allocate work out to different teams or people because you mashed it all together, right? So there are some ways we can force isolation, right? We could give the base work to a team that doesn't own any of the use cases, and that would guarantee isolation, right? And then we could size these. We'd know who's working on what. We could pay the base work in another repository, right? So you'll see this with I'm going to create a third-party library with this base function. I'm going to put it somewhere else. So the commits end up having to be in two places. The pull request, the work on the factory floor, the design work is separate. We can make structural changes to the way we operate that would force this isolation. And again, the reason we want to force this isolation is we want to know where we're really at. We want to know where the progress really is. We don't want to mash the tests together and all the requirements of use case one and the base functionality. Sometimes we do that because we're like, wow, without a use case, we don't know what this base functionality will look like. And I get that, so that creates communication. But what we don't want to do is commingle the concerns. Then we can't assign it out and we can't see where we're at. So, how can we do this? We give it to another team. We create another repo for it. We do internal discipline. I've actually seen some teams do this really well. Sometimes you'll just create another, in the same repository, you'll create a code base for this base functionality, the base test, and you won't let any pull requests include both, right? You won't let it include the base functionality. That would be internal discipline, and use case one. Those pull requests would always have to be isolated from each other. And that guarantees we know what tasks required the base functionality and what pull requests and changes were tied to the first use case, right? So how do we recognize this bundling? What we find is if we did a bunch of features and user stories, right? And we have no ability to reprioritize. I've seen this before. We're doing use case one, the base functionality is tied to it, and we go, and use case three is really small, right? Because use case one had all this, the plumbing required to make this thing work. And it's like, oh, we decided use case three needed to be done first. Use case one isn't the priority we thought it was. And it's like, oh, well, that doesn't work. We sized it and some manager will come along and be like, look, use case three is a tenth the size of use case one. Let's just do use case three first. Why can we do that? Well, we think we can do that because all the base functionality, all this plumbing is in use case one. And the reality is it doesn't belong there. So that makes it impossible to reprioritize. How do we recognize that? The inability to reprioritize says we did it wrong. The different acceptance criteria for similar work, right? In theory, use case 1, 2, and 3, the acceptance criteria for similar functionality should be similar. But use case 1, it's not because it's got all this other base functionality. You need acceptance criteria for the plumbing, right? It can't just be for the use case itself because you bundled it all together. And how else do we see this? Use case 1's taken forever. I don't understand why. Why? Because it's not just use case 1 we're implementing, right? It's all the other use cases. And then large changes, you end up with these large pull requests, large code changes, large factory changes and it's difficult to understand the size of that change because it's not just use case 1 you're implementing, it's the base functionality and all of that. And so now for us to even understand whether we did the right thing, we didn't break it down right, and that breaks us, right? So what we want to do is we want to focus on unbundling. We want to create one or more preparatory work items that give us some, and it might be a design spike, it might be a POC, a pilot, and then we need to get that base implementation and its tests and its acceptance criteria isolated. And then all the similar use cases that use that base implementation should be similarly sized, right? If they're still way off from each other and it's the first one that's the biggest, you got to understand why that was, right? And we're going to create an explicit dependency chain here that says, hey, use case 1, 2, and 3 require those 2 boxes above them. So some people are like, well, that created waterfall. No, it's called managing dependencies. It's not a waterfall. You were going to manage those dependencies anyway. You just were buried it and hid it. So how would we, what am I just going to say? The acceptance criteria should be similar for similar work. Anytime you end up with acceptance criteria for similar work that's different, it probably is a warning sign that you've done some other base plumbing for this that should be broken out. break out that which is not the same. So even if you only have one use case today, I still would recommend breaking out base work so you better understand the requirements, right? And you also isolate the acceptance criteria. You make it more modular. You create smaller work. You increase the flow metrics for this, right? Because you created smaller tasks and they can get done. And so you get a better tracking of what you're doing and you get less coupling in the work, right? The only thing I would say, right, let's not gold plate it. So you might have to come back and do more base work later. That's fine. So technicians like to build stuff, and sometimes they will push that all together so they can just be head down, working on this big piece of work. But what we need to do is do a proper breakdown. So proper breakdown and acceptance criteria are a training opportunity. If you see things that are commingled, take the opportunity to break it down and get it sized right, even though people will feel like that's extra work. It gives you better flow metrics. It gives you a better understanding of where you're at, and it isolates changes from each other that shouldn't be coupled. Have a great day.